Consider supporting Archaeosoup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Hello, Dr. Katy Soar. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you on Meet the Archaeologist. Thank you for agreeing to appear.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Now, can you just briefly introduce yourself to the boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen at home, and your role in life, as it were? Where it is you teach and what it is that you do?
Well, I'm a lecturer in classical archaeology at the University of Winchester, which in terms of classical is the Greek parts of it, basically. My background is in Bronze Age Aegean archaeology, so my PhD was on Minoans. So I do modules on the Minoans and anything in any general prehistory bit that's about the Minoans or the Mycenaeans. But I also teach sort of more general Greek archaeology or any kind of, again, team taught modules that have a Greek part in. That's where I come in. But I also teach some things on sort of folklore and popular culture as well, because I'm particularly interested in the way sort of archaeology is represented, or the way people think about or understand archaeology from a sort of non-academic perspective as well. So
Okay.
very broad church.
Well, and it was interesting. So, because when I first reached out to you and sort of said, would you be interested in chatting? You suggested that the fact that you're no longer regularly, for example, at digging, and the fact that you have moved into these broader roles and these interests meant that you would somehow diverged from a path. Do you feel that that's the case in terms of being an archaeologist?
Sometimes I feel like, if you don't dig, or you don't dig regularly, or you haven't dug for a long time, then you're not really an archaeologist. Which I don't think is true necessarily.
Well, I have to believe it's not true.
Because it has been quite a long time since I was in the field. But essentially, I'm interested in the past, and I'm interested in how material culture helps us understand the past, which is, I guess, essentially what an archaeologist does. So technically, I guess I'm an archaeologist. I'm also putting together a module teaching Introduction to Classical Archaeology. So I'm kind of teaching people, at least theoretically, how to do field surveys and stuff. So there is still that element in it. But yeah, I sometimes do think.
Do you even
everyone else in the comments talking about the digs they're going to go in the summer? I'm like, well, I'm going to go to some archives and look at some postcards.
Yeah.
I guess there's a place for that.
Yeah, it's data gathering.
Exactly.
So important. So where did you start then? How did you get into classical archaeology?
Well, when I was a kid, I had like two things that I loved, and one was folklore and one was sort of Greek mythology. And at the time, I didn't realize you could sort of study folklore. I didn't realize there was such a thing as anthropology or folklore studies or things. Whereas I knew you could study the Greek world. So I went to Birmingham to do ancient history to begin with. So I did my undergrad at Birmingham in ancient history. And I sort of gravitated there towards the more archaeological elements. So I did the module that was ancient Western Asia, which is on Mesopotamia. I did cuneiform for 2 years for my sins. And obviously sort of Greek stuff and Minoans and Mycenaeans. Also, I'd read Mary Renault at an impressionable age, books about Theseus and Knossos and stuff, and obviously that impacted my adolescent brain a bit, so that was also an influence. So that's what I did, and then I graduated and I worked for a few years, and then I decided I wanted to go back, and I went to Nottingham and did a master's in Greek archaeology, and again focusing mostly on the Minoans and Mycenaeans, and my PhD grew out of that. So it was almost, I wouldn't say accidental, but I didn't start out thinking as an undergrad, right, I'm going to get a PhD in archaeology and go and be an academic. It sort of grew as it progressed. I sort of decided to go back and do my master's because I was still interested, and out of that it sort of developed, would you be interested in doing a PhD perhaps? And then I was very lucky and I got some funding to do my PhD, and it sort of just kind of grew like that. So it's kind of slightly organic rather than any deliberate plan.
Well, and it does look that way. I mean, looking at your areas of expertise on your profile at Winchester University, it is quite a range from Minoan and Mycenaean archaeology through to photography and archaeology, um, and and also archaeology and folklore. I see there, of course, is still it's a named interest, and you
Yes.
carried it
Well,
with you.
I started
So
to figure out ways I could perhaps bring my childhood interest into what I currently do.
yeah,
So
so folklore. This aspect fascinates me, and to a certain extent, I imagine there's a bit of crossover with my own professional interests, in so much as I've developed uh, a big interest in the way that archaeologists and their work are mediated,
mm,
especially in particular by the media when it comes to how the public perceives archaeology.
yeah.
But it is where do you come at this sort of thing? In so much as
Well, similarly as well, in a sense, I'm interested in how people who aren't necessarily in academia or archaeology think about or interact with
hmm,
archaeology. And I think folklore is an interesting way of thinking about that as well, because in a way it's almost archaeological because we're interested in what these things meant to people in the past.
hmm,
And obviously, I don't know, Stonehenge or a stone circle or a barrow or something like that doesn't stop having meaning once the primary function or what it was built for no longer occurs there. These things stay in the landscape and people interact with them and people think about them and people incorporate them into their lives in lots of different ways. And the kind of stories that people tell about those, I think, are interesting ways of understanding attitudes or viewpoints as well. They give us a sort of life story of this monument beyond its original. Not that a monument ever has a singular function anyway, but the people from the medieval period talking about Iron Age or Bronze Age or Neolithic monuments or the landscape features also tells us about them, their attitudes to the past, their attitudes to their own past and their landscape. And I think it's a really interesting way of tapping into that. So a way of still thinking about archaeology in the past. And also, like I said, a similar thing you would say, just how people think about or interact with archaeology. I mean, people still have stories they tell about archaeological sites now, which we could consider to be folklore. I mean, I don't really want to, go down the pseudo-archaeology road, but that's a kind of way people create ideas.
and I mean, do you mind if we just very briefly talk a little bit about that pseudo archaeological element, though? Just very briefly, in so much as I'm also interested in some of that other stuff as well. But recently, I've noticed an upsurge in comments and commentary about those spaces and places where so-called mainstream archaeology and shall we charitably say fringe ideas interact, and the way that sometimes the representative of so-called mainstream archaeology, and often whoever it is that interacts with this site or people, place, or idea or book, is held up as the monolithic representative of all mainstream thinking. Um, that in those moments, the interaction is essentially confrontational. I'm thinking in particular of I still get comments on some commentary that I did about a reported incident where Zahi Hawass was potentially, we're not quite sure of the circumstances, slightly doorstepped into having a debate about um, Göbekli Tepe, and was left with Graham Hancock. And his reaction was so immediate and visceral and essentially angry at being even in the same room with this man, that Graham was left looking like the reasonable person, saying, "Now, come on, Zahi. We know that we don't debate. We don't do straw man arguments. We debate or ad hominem attacks. We debate the topic at hand." And so, do you think that there's room in folklore and in having what some might consider to be softer ideas or softer, less provable notions surrounding artifacts and the sites to meet people where they say they want to be met? i.e. talking about maybe, Wiccan or alien or other interactions with monuments. If you mention Stonehenge, for example, or if someone's going to mention Druids,
Yeah.
is that a way in the door which isn't essentially just an argument, do you think?
I think there is room for multiple viewpoints and multiple perspectives on these. Because, like I said, I don't think any monument or whatever ever had one fixed meaning, even when it was built. Who you are or how you interpret Stonehenge, for example. Just use that because obviously it's the most famous monument.
Stonehenge.
Stonehenge. No one knows who they were or what they were doing. I always throw a bit of spinal tapping whenever I do a lecture on Stonehenge. They don't get it, but never mind. I do it for me. But
do you then hand out a DVD to everyone? If you check under your seats, you
I tell them to go and because when they just sit there looking really confused and thinking I just had terrible taste in music, I just tell them as their homework to go home and check out Spinal Tap.
Watch Spinal Tap. Yeah.
Yes, it'll blow their minds.
In ancient times, hundreds of years before the dawn of history, lived an ancient race of people, the Druids.
I don't think even when it was being used in the back in prehistory that it ever had one meaning to everybody. I think obviously who you are, where you come from, geographically as well as whatever will impact how you experience or what you think about these monuments. So I don't think having multiple interpretations of it is necessarily a new thing or a bad thing. It can become that when you start to, obviously, there's been some stuff, obviously more recently, with sort of, far right groups infiltrating, if you want that word, or incorporating archaeology and folklore into their own narratives.
Wayland Smithy.
There was something about Wayland Smithy, wasn't there?
Had people gathering them,
and obviously that's harmful, but not the less extreme people, the people who just have what they feel to be perhaps a connection to this site for whatever reason. I think there is room for discussion there. Like I said, I don't think any site has any one fixed meaning. And as long as these narratives aren't necessarily harmful to other people, I'm open to hearing these. And again, it gives you an idea of how non-archaeologists, non-academics think about these, what that means, what that can tell us about, the world around us right now. I think I'm blabbering, but...
Do you think any of this is connected with the notion of authority? I.e., the fact that, so again, going back to Stonehenge, in the case of King Arthur Pendragon, the self-proclaimed king of the Druids, which as a Welshman I find very strange that this man has done that, in so much as Druids continue to have a certain cultural function in the Eisteddfod and so on and so forth, that he anyway. His assertions surrounding Stonehenge and its landscape often imply a continued guardianship and a sort of essentially a hidden knowledge, a connection, which repeatedly his assertions are shown to be lacking in that context. So, for example, recently so-called Stonehenge was discovered, the massive series of very large holes into the ground, was the shafts into the ground. I couldn't help but think, possibly slightly cynically, well, why didn't he already know about it? If you know what I mean. And this is where this notion of authority comes in so much as I'm happy to listen to stories about a place. But if someone makes an assertion about its function in particular, then that has to be backed up, hopefully, with research and ideas and tangible stuff, not just a preconceived assertion that you keep on looking for proof for, no matter how much isn't coming your way. Do you think this is possibly where so for example I can think of folklorish projects which have surrounded Hadrian's Wall, where actually the stories which have been gathered have been very interesting, and it's also have added context to interpretation. But no one's ever said Hadrian's Wall was actually built by, you know, by a giant who liked walls. You know, it, so is that maybe the line that we have to sort of be careful about in terms of actually where does your assertion come from, and what's the motivation behind that assertion, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with people like, this is Arthur Pendragon, I believe. I've heard of him. I'm not too aware of his work, but I have heard of him. I think it's when people assert that their interpretation is the only interpretation, whether that be your archaeologist or your druid or whatever. I think it's when that becomes, the only way this can be interpreted that it becomes problematic. I think it's okay to debate and have conversation if you're open to the fact that, maybe that's not correct, or maybe we need to know more about this. I think it's when people start to assert, no, this was entirely this, 100% this, or this is what it meant to people, or this is what it means, or this is what it was used for, or, the Druids were worshipping here back in, the Bronze Age. It's like, that it becomes problematic when you're not open to the other ideas and interpretations.
And do you think that sometimes public perception puts that onto archaeologists, as this notion that archaeologists, in requiring essentially scientific method and some sort of proof behind their hypotheses, are also trying to completely own interpretation? Because I mean, I can think of a couple of archaeologists who will go to their grave defending what they think of a site. And maybe that is a problem. Maybe actually those people need to be more open to. It's difficult, isn't it? Because as soon as you talk about pluralism, you go down very weird and difficult rabbit holes.
I know. I don't want to sort of be like, yay, everybody. I think there is perhaps an idea that archaeologists are like, we have done this scientific dig and this is what happens. But I think that's a sort of narrow idea of archaeologists. We're constantly looking for new information, and otherwise, why would we carry on investigating places like Stonehenge if we thought we knew what it was and what it was done for and when it was built and who used it? Why would we continue to do survey and everything in the landscape around it? So
we're interested in what's new about the past.
Exactly.
Yes.
So if we thought we had the answers and knew everything, then we wouldn't be still investigating these sites. So I think there's perhaps this idea that archaeologists are like gatekeepers, and what we know is what's true. And there can be no deviation from that, when it's in fact we're constantly learning new things, and we want to learn new things, and we want to find out different things that maybe make us approach these differently or think about them differently. So I think there is perhaps an idea that, yes, archaeologists are very authoritarian or strict about who can have this knowledge, and we have this opinion, and this is the right opinion, and this is the only opinion, when in fact our opinions are always changing and developing based on the new evidence we find. So I think perhaps we have people think of us perhaps as being a bit more static than we actually are, because otherwise why would we do, if we do one dig and find some stuff out, why would we do any more at a site, or continue to see,
dig one Roman fort and you're done, and
then we know everything. So why would we continue to do surveys around landscape and Stonehenge and find out more about the landscape if we didn't want to know more, if we didn't want to add to our knowledge and create more nuanced or deeper or whatever interpretations or ideas about what it was used for and how people interacted with it?
I often find myself in moments like this thinking about the Indiana Jones films and Indy's assertion that if you want truth, go down the hall for the philosophy class.
Yes, to the philosophy class.
Yeah. Here we're looking for some facts, and again, in that sense, I suppose there is a public perception of a certain physical end point, I suppose, to archaeological inquiry, which is backed up by, for example, Indiana Jones's avarice, one might say. But so stakeholders, stories, folklore, all of this it's floating around, it's swirling around. But give me something tangible. Like, where's this leading, and where's it led you, more importantly?
Well, I haven't really taken part myself in any of these kind of big projects. I've been sort of looking at it from the wayside, and wayside, that's the wrong word.
Cheering from the sidelines.
And my own sort of delvings into this a bit have been sort of playing around with things that I've just had an interest in my whole life, like folklore, but also things like folk horror and 19th century horror literature, which is just something I'm very interested in. And I've been kind of playing around with how I can incorporate that into my research and still be employed by an archaeology department. So,
yep.
So the sort of folklore around archaeological sites and the idea how in a lot of sort of horror stories, particularly in the 19th century, archaeological sites or archaeological items are kind of the focus of fear or horror. I'm kind of interested in why that is. So if I can sort of like advertise a little bit, Hellebore. It's a zine produced by Maria Perez Cuervo, which is about collection of writings and essays to folk horror and the things that inspire it: folklore, myth, history, archaeology, psychogeography, and the occult. So in this particular one, I've been talking a little bit about those ideas of stone circles and the stories people tell about them, and why perhaps they are the focus of stories about fear, because the folklore narratives tend to be about things like petrification or transgression. And then you've got sort of folk horror stories or which focus around stone circles as sites, and obviously this idea of sort of human sacrifice and druids and all this stuff, which is very common in popular stories or popular imagination. But as you say, when you look into the actual evidence for it, it's pretty non-existent.
So when you say petrification, is that the notion that if you're not careful, you may become one of the stones? Is that sort of
the idea that if you've perhaps transgressed, dancing on the Sabbath being a particular common one, you will be turned to stone. So the circles themselves are people or witches or giants who transgressed in some way and have been turned to stone. So it's often related to doing something on the Sabbath that you shouldn't be doing. But there are other ones as well. Just someone robbing a church. It's a stone on Anglesey, and it's the robber. You can see the bag over his shoulder. Yeah, exactly.
Just frozen.
People stealing cows on Uist, get turned to stone. So there's a general, not all the stone circles, but a lot of them have this connection to transgression or punishment or something. So I'm just kind of interested in why archaeology and archaeological sites often invoke this kind of notion of fear or horror or something like that. So
it's something that I've been sharing during the pandemic. Has been stories from my childhood in growing up in Wales. And in particular around Halloween, I really love delving back into some of the books that I got as a teenager, which talk about fairies and stone circles and this kind of thing. And it's interesting how, in that sense, that they are abstractions of a physical place. Because often, as a teenager, I'd read about this stone in a field, go, oh, turn up and be like, oh, it's a stone in a field. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Whereas I imagine being there at the right time of day or having the right storyteller with you is going to augment that experience. And is this part of the value then of this type of approach to an archaeological site? It gives you more than the simple fact of the geological blob in a field, and tells you something about how people relate to it.
Exactly, yeah. I think it really does. Particularly, things like folklore and folk tales, which are coming from, I don't know, the medieval period onwards, perhaps. Again, it's not just how we react now, but how people in the past reacted as well. So it gives you a sort of inkling as to, I don't know, the reception of archaeology in the past, which obviously there's not going to be too much evidence for that, but looking at the ways people thought about or the stories they told about archaeological sites or landscapes in the past, normally through stories that have survived in some way, gives you a bit of an inkling into how people saw their own history, their own past, or their own place in the landscape, or through the stories that they told. And we still do that, not necessarily through what we might call folklore, but through TV or books or something. You still get these ideas. So yeah, I think it's an interesting way of seeing how people react to or think about these landscapes. And I think again, it is like you say, you go in the time you go, the time of year or whatever. I mean, I've been to Nine Ladies in the Peak District many times because I grew up not too far from there. And sunny afternoon, it's like, oh, isn't that nice? It's a stone circle, how lovely. But there was one time when I was doing my PhD, we took a friend up there who was Greek and had never been there, and it was December, and it was, all the trees were, stark and empty, and it was, I don't know, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but the sun was already setting. And you go there then, and it's twilight, and the landscape is a lot more bare and stark, and it is.
And
The atmosphere
sound
is totally
quality is
different.
different. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So all these things do impact on the way you experience the landscape, you experience these archaeological sites. And again, it's the same site, and you're the same person, but this is what it kind of was mean when things never have a fixed meaning.
Well, and in that sense, then, just off camera, you were talking about how this also applies to Knossos as well.
Yeah.
In that sense, and how this notion of fixed and unfixed seemingly can be applied to even the most typist of type sites, seemingly, or the most famous of sites. I mean, how do you start to unpick a place like Knossos?
Well, I've been looking at it mainly through my props here. The way it's depicted in postcards, particularly of the early 20th century. So kind of around about the period Evans is excavating. He excavated from 1900 till the 1930s. So I'm interested in postcards from roughly that period, because I'm interested in how these ideas that he created were disseminated, where they were picked up, how people reacted to them. So this one in particular, this one's actually written in 1932. This is because I'm also been looking a little bit as well what people say. And if what they're saying on their postcards, unfortunately, most of them are just like, Crete is lovely, it's very hot. The food was great. You know, there's nothing particularly tangible. I've only got a couple of examples so far, though, of ones with actual writing on the back.
Well, incidentally, if people do have postcards, do you want them to get in touch with you?
Absolutely, that would be fantastic. I mean, I'm looking mainly at this period at the moment, but I'm up for looking at how they change over time and the elements of the building, the elements of the landscape, that are considered important in that period, enough to be photographed and reproduced and sent around the world.
Yeah. So presumably, though, those ideas are informing the literal framing of the site through postcards.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. And what, I mean, have you found anything particularly interesting that someone's written about the sites, or?
Like I said, I've only got one or two that actually have any inscriptions on writings on the back, because I think, like now, a lot of people would collect postcards just to have a collection, not necessarily to send. So, but let me just find the one that's particularly interesting. Well, this is interesting because it just gives you a little glimpse into the actual archaeological excavation and the history of archaeology there, because this tower is no longer there. But it just gives you a glimpse into sort of the actual archaeological methodology that was used.
Well, and at this time, postcards were produced by local photographers, weren't they?
Yeah, I've mainly got the ones produced by a gentleman called Nikolaos Alakiadis, who worked in Archaeon at the time. But he seemed to be quite a big publisher of postcards. But again, it's a local.
They'd have plates which then they'd print. And so some locally, for example, here in the northeast of England, where I live and work, we have a studio in Whitley Bay that's just basically doing all the postcards for Whitley Bay, because they can go out at all times of year, photograph it, and then produce prints for the local shops, this kind of thing. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. This one was quite interesting because it says on the bottom, prisons of Knossos. And I remember looking at it and trying to figure out where it was at Knossos. And I was like, well, as far as we're aware, through centuries of experience, there is no prison, there's no dungeon or anywhere on the site of Knossos that could ostensibly be considered a dungeon. So I was looking at where is this? I was trying to look at the village in the background and map it with my own experience of the site. And I gave a talk at UCL for the History of Archaeological sort of network about these. And I put this up and I said, I'm drawing a bit of a blank on this one. And then Professor Todd Whitelaw, who I'd worked with at Knossos, emailed me and said, I don't think that is actually Knossos. And he showed me Talisos is another site about 15, 20 kilometers away, which was being dug roughly the same time. And we kind of matched it up with some pictures from that book, and it's actually a different site.
Interesting.
So what I'm interested in, is this deliberate in the sense that prisons of Knossos, you think of dungeons, you think of the Minotaur. Is this a deliberate conflation of two different sites to perpetuate this idea, this myth that people know about? Or is it just a mistake? I mean, these things happen. Some of the postcards talk about the South House at Knossos and call it the priest's house, just because they confuse them. And in fact, I believe one of the excavators in the 50s also made that same mistake. So it could just be a genuine error. But is it this conflation of the stories and the myths deliberately kind of brought together so that people will recognize it and people will think, oh, I know that story, and feel this connection to it. So I was kind of interested in those ideas as well.
And do you think that it's ever possible to get away from that, these more romanticized notions? So presumably, I mean, whether that's an honest mistake, or maybe even just pandering to a market, people who are in the heat of Greece and want something to send back to their friends, or to take home with them. Do you think that it's ever possible to detach a site from all of the baggage that we've laid upon it? I mean, this is where once again we return to Stonehenge in that sense, in so much as I think Stonehenge has an unhealthy amount of baggage. It's really hard to talk about that thing in its true context, that place, because of all the stuff that people bring to it. And in that sense, should we be seeking to detach a site from its
I don't know, because
romanticised
I'm
context?
interested in this baggage. I'm interested in what Evans brought to that, his own baggage, if you will, how that turned into the official report or the official excavation of Knossos and things like that. And then again, how that baggage got taken up by the public, if you will. And I think with any big site, as you say, Stonehenge, Knossos, it's going to happen, particularly when it's something like Knossos, which has this, centuries of stories and myths associated with it as well. To Stonehenge to some extent as well, with the whole Merlin and the, bringing the stones over from Ireland. But I think it's also worth thinking about their relationship to other sites, because you don't get this baggage, you don't get this idea. So it's the palaces of sort of Malia or Phaistos on Crete as well. So I think I always try to recommend people go to Knossos, definitely, but then go to Phaistos.
Yeah.
And I think you can see similar things with Stonehenge. There's so much focus on Stonehenge and to some extent Orkney, and the stone circles up there as well.
Go to Castle Rig.
But there's lots in the middle that people, it's like these are the main sites. The massive stone circles are the most important. And it's like, but there are other sites as well. Perhaps we should look at this site in comparison to that site and think about it in a wider context rather than these standalone, monolithic sites. And there is a tendency, I think, to do that.
So should we consider it to be an additive process as opposed to a surgical detachment? Perhaps we should be adding to the baggage that gives context to that baggage, as opposed to,
I think if you
maybe even not use the word baggage.
Yeah, maybe not. I think as long as people are aware the context of these developments and stuff, they add to the story of the site. They add, I think, to the richness of the site. But often when I give this talk, or I do just look on things like TripAdvisor, or talk to people who've been to Knossos, many of them are unaware that a lot of that is built by Evans in the early 20th century. Yeah. And it's quite funny if you look on things like TripAdvisor, and it's kind of split. People are like, I just found out that this was built in the 20th century, and they're shocked and appalled, and 1-star review. Whereas other people are like, oh, it was brilliant. It gave me a real feeling for what the site looked like. So it's an interesting kind of question about the benefits or not. And I mean, even if you wanted to, you couldn't get rid of those now because they are part of the heritage of Knossos in their own right. And but I'm interested in sort of as well the public reaction to that, because it's not very clear at Knossos. There's no big sign going, this was built in 1930 by Arthur Evans Pace. Yeah, there's nothing really to tell that. And then I haven't been on a tour there with one of the tour guides, but I'm not sure whether or not they explain that as well. Certainly if you're just wandering around by yourself, there's nothing really to indicate that. So it's interesting to see people's reaction when they discover that. Like, some people feel genuinely cheated, that they've been what they thought was genuine archaeology or genuine ruins is not. And other people are like, well, actually, it really helped me understand the past better. I felt more, it helped me feel like what the palace would have been like, or what the person walking through the palace would have experienced. So, and I think, both reactions are valid. So I think as long as it's understood and contextualized, the baggage kind of almost adds to the heritage of the site in some sense. And again, perhaps baggage is the wrong word. But I think people should be made aware that, this wall here, this column, that wall painting, that was put back together again. That's not, this is, for want of a better term, an artist's impression of Knossos at the time, made 3D.
speculation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
And if it, sorry.
well, I was going to say, and then I mean, but you sometimes hear the old adage that that laws, for example, are like sausages. You don't want to see how they're made. And maybe the same applies to sites like Knossos. And yet, for some people, clearly, knowing what goes into the making of a site like that will add to the experience of the
Yeah.
flavour.
So I think it's there now. Evans's reconstructions are there, for better or for worse. They're not going anywhere. So maybe incorporating that more into the experience and the learning about Knossos to the casual tourist or the visitor, but also in a more academic setting as well, just sort of gives us more to think about and more ideas to work with. Because, like I said, it's not going anywhere, so we've got to work with it.
Yeah.
And like I say, if people do go to Crete, I'm always like, yeah, go see it, experience it, then perhaps go to somewhere like Phasos, which is not built up. It's just the sort of ground level ruins as they were when they were excavated early in the 20th century, and experience that as well, and get a feel for both these sites. And then it's up to them which ones they prefer and where they what they do with that. So I think it's not going anywhere, so we just need to make the most of it and think about how we can incorporate that into learning, into academia, but also just into the more general history of the site as well, for the more casual visitor who's just there. They've gone on holiday to Crete. One day on the holiday, there's a trip for everyone on the coach to Knossos, and they're like, okay, we'll go and have a look. And and they're going to take that with them as well, and they're going to think about it when they get home and maybe tell their friends or whatever. So I think just it's there. Let's incorporate it. Let's make something with it.
How do you find these sorts of questions are received by fellow archaeologists? In so much as I can think of some more lab-based people, shall we say, who would be deeply uncomfortable with incorporating speculation or stories or folklore, which for them has an unbounded potential to veer off completely off course. How do you find people respond to this way of thinking about a site?
Generally, I've just had lots of positive things. I've given this talk about the postcards a few times, and it's quite interesting where you give it and who you give it to. I've given it in archaeology departments for like the Wednesday afternoon seminar. I've given it at sort of local historical groups as well. And a lot of people, when I've given it at sort of a more academic things, are generally interested in thinking about how their sites. I wonder what the postcards are like of my site and things like that. Whereas the more sort of historical societies, the more sort of general public groups that just want to know a bit more about, so what did it really look like, or a bit more about Evans or something like that. So I haven't personally found anybody not feel too comfortable with it. I think people do like, but I think there's room. I think people are like, that's really interesting. That's not my area. That's not what but I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it, because most people will then say, well, have you looked at Stonehenge in postcards, or have you looked at the pyramids or something like that? And I think it's something that's quite broad, and people will probably not do themselves, but it just makes them think about, oh, I wonder how my site is depicted or something like that. So I haven't found any issues with it personally, because I don't think one distracts from the other. I think perfectly valid. You can be lab based and be very focused on analysing the isotopic makeup of so you can see I'm not lab based. I can't think of it on my head. But
do the thing with the whatnots.
The photography of this. Where did the clay from this pot come from? At the same time, we'd be like, but also, what do people now think about this pot?
Yeah.
I think there's room for all of that, and we certainly need the lab-based stuff, of course, but I don't think one distracts from the other. I think it's just a very broad picture, and that's kind of why I really like archaeology. It is such a broad thing, and there's room for all kinds of ways of studying and thinking about the past, and they all just, I think, add to each other rather than detract. We're just trying to create a picture of what happened, and that picture is constantly changing from all kind of perspectives. So I think that's one of the reasons I really like archaeology. Is there's whatever your particular interest in the past is it on the macro level, it's on the micro level. Are you very lab-based and scientific, or are you more theoretical and think about reception? There is room for your particular interests.
Well, actually, we've wandered there, and presumably quite naturally because of your position at the university, we've wandered in there into some really sound advice for people who might want to get into archaeology in that sense. And normally that would be like a formal like question I would ask someone, because there are 2 or 3 particular questions that I ask for the sake of cross-referencing these interviews. And so in that sense, would that be essentially your advice to anyone who's interested in archaeology? Just find a way to, or find the way in which your interests intersect with the broader archaeological world.
Absolutely, because there are so many ways of studying the past within archaeology. I remember talking to someone once at a conference it was an interdisciplinary conference, and she was a lecturer in literature, and she said, I always wanted to do archaeology, but I was told I needed chemistry A-level. I was like, no one told me that. So I think there are certain perceptions that, some people think it's very scientific, I need lab-based skills. And it's like, no, not at all. You can do that, and you can be very lab-based, so that's your interest. Then archaeology is totally for you. But also, if your background, I did languages and history, you can do archaeology then as well. It's a really broad area, and you might not know what interests you until you start, which is why, in the first year you'll get a bit of everything. Maybe you never did sciences beyond GCSE, but you discover I really like looking at animal bones. Who think it? And then there's that. Or a lot of people sort of maybe go into the theory module going, oh god, but then they discover there's a way of thinking about the past and like, oh, that's really interesting. And there's so many ways of approaching the past and thinking about the past. And it doesn't just have to be digging. Now you could get into sort of heritage ideas and public outreach and things like that. But it is so broad that I think if you have an interest in the past in any way, you can find somewhere in archaeology that will incorporate your particular interests.
Well, and I suppose also something which, if you don't mind just me adding to that a little bit, would be just to say that also no one's going to force you if you are more positivistically driven and you deal with the data as you see it. No one's going to force you necessarily to make an interpretation. It can be someone else's job to interpret that data. So
no one archaeologist does everything on their own. No. You work together to build a story, I guess. And
building worlds.
We're built, yes, exactly.
Building worlds.
If you're much more comfortable in the lab sorting things, understanding things, and you don't want to make, as you say, those big interpretive frameworks, no, you don't have to at all. At the same time, if you don't feel you're very good at science or comfortable in the lab, that's not something you need to do either. There is room for everybody's interests and expertise in archaeology, which is why I think it's such a great subject, is that it can incorporate such a wide range of interests and areas and skills. Going back to the beginning, people's ideas of like, okay, an archaeologist is out there digging and troweling and taking all the field survey work and everything. It's like, yes, they do, but they also don't.
No, yeah, or it can morph. It can change from one to the other. Yeah.
I mean, I've done that. I've been out there. I've done my time in the trenches, literally, and it's integral to archaeology. I'm totally not denying that, but it's not where I feel most comfortable within archaeology. But then there are other people who digging is their passion, and that's what they love doing the most. And then it works for them as well. So, and we all work together, and I think that's why it's such a great subject.
Inevitably, this brings me on to the second key question that I ask everyone, and this is with regards to the challenges that archaeology is facing. And these challenges, obviously, they change over the years. Our context of this interview today is going to be very different to someone I interviewed 5 years ago, maybe. But it sounds as though, for example, you have very little trouble recommending archaeology to people because of the various ways that you can do archaeology, and hopefully the various ways that you can apply those skills to whatever career you want to pursue next.
Yeah.
If you're able to communicate that effectively, because for some people, I sometimes see students, or sometimes students will contact and ask questions along the lines of, if I do archaeology, will I ever be able to be a banker? And you're like, yes. Yeah, John Lubbock, he was a banker, So there are issues there in terms of how archaeology relates to the rest of the world, and I think it sounds quite rightly as though you're passionate about that, and as though presumably your students get that from the experience at Winchester as well. But what do you think are the challenges then that are facing archaeology more broadly, but also actually this current cohort of people who are learning, who and what they are in an archaeological context. What's next, do you think, for those people? And
it's
for
kind of hard
us,
to answer
frankly.
because everything is changing so quickly at the moment. I mean, there's the big thing at the moment is, the change in planning laws. So the whole sort of rescue archaeology and field and commercial archaeology, how that's going to impact that. Not an area, again, I'm entirely knowledgeable about, but obviously that's just come in. Whether that's going to happen, again, everything's changing so fast at the moment. What's going to happen with Brexit?
And just for context for people at home, I should just say we're in between an announcement of an intent to change planning policy, which sounds quite aggressive, and the outcome of consultation. So that's very much still up in the air. So that's the reason why we can't be definitive at this point.
Yes.
Yeah.
So who knows how that'll come out and how much impact that will have on archaeology. I think, though, what I've always said to people who are interested in archaeology is that there is no real one degree that's going to guarantee you a job, unless sort of law or medicine, perhaps, obviously, in that kind of regard. But if you want to study something and you enjoy that and you're interested in it, you will find ways in that to incorporate that. I've always been sure it's better to do something you're interested in, because obviously that you start off on a slightly higher level because you're interested and you want to learn. Then I'm doing this because I feel it'll be better for me in the long run. And archaeology, as I've said, is such a broad touch. You will get so many different skills out of it. The transferable skills is one of those buzzwords that I admit kind of annoys me slightly, but it is true. There are so many people I know from my undergrad and my master's who've gone on to do all kinds of things. There are many field archaeologists, academics as well, those of us who are lucky enough in this current job market to get an academic job. But teachers, lawyers, obviously they're the fairly, going to do teacher training and stuff like that, but all kinds of things as well. Heritage jobs, museum jobs. It does offer an opportunity for lots of different
So in that sense, would you say that you're optimistic then?
Not necessarily talking about archaeology in general. I'm slightly pessimistic about everything under this current government, if I'm allowed to say that up here, about this kind of move away from focus purely on STEM subjects and things like that. That kind of worries me, because I don't think, and this kind of idea that the jobs that are worth it and your university is ranked on the jobs that you get afterwards, dependent on the salary they get, which I think is a not a good way of measuring the value of a job, because in that sense that means bankers give a lot to society, teachers and nurses do not, and I find that, or social workers who don't earn great amounts of money do not. It's not as valuable in this scheme of things. So I worry about it in the general sense of university rankings being based on the career progression in terms of salary. I think that's a worrying development, because archaeologists do not earn huge amounts of money. We do not live in big fancy houses. So that element I find worrying about, but that's not just about archaeology. That's something that affects the entirety of higher education. So in that sense, I worry.
Yeah, well, and in that sense, I mean, if you want, we can ever so slightly open that up in so much as, obviously, it's easy to. Believe me, I would very happily scream, shout, and swear and rant about all sorts of things that are happening at the moment. But do you think, just sort of to keep this on some sort of objective level, do you think then that there is a question at the moment that's up in the air about the philosophy of education and the function of education, the purpose?
I think there is definitely at the moment, and the whole idea of what role universities are playing. Are we supposed to be producing people to go into specific careers, or are we just encouraging people to ways of thinking, not how to think or what to think, but just the tools to be able to think more broadly and analyze things and come to their own conclusions, which is what I like to think I'm doing, rather than dealing. And again, I think archaeology is, because there's multiple ways of thinking about the past, this does encourage this way of thinking of that, not what to think or how to think, but just the skills to analyze things and come to your own conclusions. So I think there is that philosophical question about what is the purpose of university. particularly in the last few years as well, with fees coming in as well. What our role is as lecturers, but also as universities in general. I think I always maintain that I think an archaeology degree is valuable. It is one of the most multidisciplinary degrees you can do. Even if you do a BA rather than a BSc, there will be some science elements in that, but also some, it touches on all kinds of. Even if you do it.
Well, that's the interview over, I'm afraid.
I'm just saying you can do a BSc, but if that's your consult scientists here. Some of my best friends are scientists. Or people do a BA. I have a BA. Let's scrap that bit.
No, I'm happy to keep it. I have a BA as well. Raise your hand if you have a BA.
Yeah, but even if you're not, you haven't done it specifically as a scientific.
Well, and again, it's how the perception, the broader perception of the value of something plugs into something like as crude as the labour market or the economy, particularly when it relates to, for example, production of new IPs and chemical solutions for things and so on and so forth, engineering, etc. There is a and I think understandably there's a pressure and there's a focus on that at the moment, but people often, whether it's correct or incorrect, they often attribute to people like Churchill this notion of what is the essentially what in the Second World War, well, let's shut down the museums. Well, if we shut down the museums, what are we fighting for? In that sense, what are we producing an economy for if we're also not providing the artists, the makers, and the historical context for our lives, and also the constant, as we touched on at the beginning, the search for what's new about that, as opposed to just learning by rote, or this happened and then that happened, and never putting that into context. I feel as though we're at risk of slightly depressing ourselves here. So we can move on, but it's actually, I think this is important as much as this is now. This is the zeitgeist that we are in as archaeologists in the UK right now, and I think that's worthwhile just flagging that. Hopefully on a more positive note, as we come towards the end of this interview, I don't want to take up your whole morning. What's on the horizon for you? Is there anything exciting or interesting? And presumably, at the moment, there's a big focus on providing pandemic conscious learning, isn't there? So there's that, but also, what else is on the horizon for you?
Well, I'm hoping, obviously, like I say, at the moment we're entirely focused on making sure the learning experience, at least definitely in the first semester, and see what happens as we move into 2021, is as thorough and enjoyable as well for the students navigating this brave new world of online blended learning. But hopefully in the near future, I'd like to do a bit more with my postcards. My collection is quite small. So as you said earlier, if anyone has any postcards, please send them my way. Because what I'd like to do perhaps is create kind of a database, because I've talked about it on Twitter before and people are like, "Oh, where can I see your postcards?" And I'm like, "Well, I've got a small collection." But so I'd quite like to create some kind of database where I can upload them, but also other people could contribute their ones as well. And I also think a wider project around postcards and perhaps heritage, because it allows you to explore the heritage and the archaeology of your own town, perhaps, in a way that you're not going to be able to do now archaeologically, because town centres built on top of things, you can't stay them. A way of people kind of reconnecting or understanding the heritage of where they come from, using something that everyone knows about. Everyone has probably got a collection of postcards somewhere in their house, even if it's just one pin to the fridge or something like that. It allows a way of understanding the heritage, or understanding the archaeology of big sites like Knossos, but also the town you live in a way that's accessible to the public. It doesn't involve having to put together huge projects that obviously, particularly in very urban areas, would be impossible to do anyway. And there is that element of storytelling created, so I think it incorporates quite a lot of the things I'm interested in as well, because through either the things written on the back of the postcards or the people who own the postcards and telling stories about where they came from or how they got these postcards, it's a way of connecting the public to their heritage and to their past, but also thinking about the way that past has been framed or encapsulated. So I'm hoping at some point to be able to explore that further in maybe a bigger research project.
Well, can I just briefly share with you an observation Just out of interest, because when I was doing my degree at Durham, I noticed that people always took a photo of the cathedral from a very particular spot. There's this viewing platform next to the mill, just by the weir, the weir, where there's a little waterfall, and there's this. It's the picture postcard shot. That's the thing. That's what everyone takes. That's
Yeah.
Durham. And I remember I was slightly annoyed. I have to say, I was in my third year. I was a bit stressed. I took my degree much more seriously than probably I should have done, frankly. And as I was walking past this, I feel so embarrassed now. This tourist, they were taking the photo, and I sort of stopped and went, "Have you considered standing just over there? Like, have you considered taking a photo from just here, only like 5 meters away, but it changes the framing." And I said it in what I felt was possibly a slightly angry, sarcastic way, because I was very annoyed that day. I was angry about something else. But actually, they kind of went, and then they sort of shuffled over, took the photo from a different angle, and they went, "It changes everything." And I was like, "You're welcome," and then sort of moved on. And
you changed their perspective on.
yeah, isn't that interesting? And yet that person would have walked through that space to get to the or would have been walking through that space to get away from that photo spot. And I think that's there's something interesting there in terms of as you're saying about, for example, Knossos. People's attention are directed to certain angles, certain places, and presumably they then go for, like, so in the Leaning Tower of Pisa, for example, they then try and find essentially the same spot to do the the leaning thing.
Yeah.
And yet just changing the angle, looking at it from a different place would presumably break some perceptions of a site. But is that actually an aspect of this in terms of where this goes? Is it, or is it much more about tracing why, for example, everyone is standing in that particular spot taking a photo of Durham Cathedral?
Perhaps a bit of both. I'd be interested. Like I said, I need to get a few more, I think, postcards to compare. Oh, is it always the same perspective? Are there ones that are breaking out of this mold and looking at things from a different angle? But also what you said made me kind of think about when people take photos of a site, they wait till no one's in the picture.
Yeah.
And it's like, the cathedral or Stonehenge or Knossos or any other site or building, whatever, without people in, which is not how that site is designed or meant. It's meant for people to work, play, whatever they do in that particular function, in that particular area.
So it's almost that there's people intruding on your moment.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like this idea that these sites are better empty.
Yeah.
When there's no one there. And so, these are just ideas that sort of spiral. And every time I talk about postcards, something else pops up and I go, oh, that'd be interesting. So I think there's quite a lot to mine in this particular.
But also, I suppose in that sense, that they are arguably being reduced down to an artifact in the same way that, before we started recording, you were talking about the Lego model above my head just there. And the thing is that's a contained little curio. That's something which I can interact with at my pleasure. But if I don't know how this would happen, but if a miniature person walked in and started leaning on Indiana Jones, the minifigure, I'd be like, get out of it! This is my diorama. This is my moment with this monument. Well, not that it's a monument, but you know what I mean. And do you think there's an element of that where people feel as though each person sort of deserves that picture postcard moment with the spot because of this sort of consciousness of it being photographable?
I think certainly these images turn a site, S-I-T-E, into a site, S-I-G-H-T, and people want to have that experience of being there at this site that is worth seeing in a kind of, I was there, I've been there, I've seen that. But that then perpetuates this idea that is the only way of experiencing that site. Is from that perspective, from that angle. So yeah, if you start getting people to move 5 meters there or look at it from slightly different angles, and you get a much broader perspective. But there is, I think, that idea of claiming in a way, like I was here, I've seen it, which doesn't necessarily give you the best experience. It just sort of shows, tick boxes that I went to that site, but it doesn't mean that you've experienced the site in the way perhaps it was supposed to be. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think there is an element of that. It's, as you say, it's slightly different, I think, with Pisa. That's quite an interesting one, as you say, because a lot of places people don't want people in the photo, but then Pisa is deliberately that thing. And I've done it. I'm sorry. There's no way to take a photo at Pisa without people in it, because you do that and then your photos are full of people in the background all doing it at different
doing
angles.
strange sort of martial arts stances.
Yeah, exactly. It's very strange. But I think there is this idea of kind of almost like, perhaps ownership is the wrong word, but
something else that comes to mind was last year we had a family gathering in the Republic of Ireland, and we were down in the southwest, and on the way home we were coming back. So home in terms of home for my in-laws in Northern Ireland. We were stopping over for the night before we came back here. And on the way home, we passed through what I suddenly realised was the Boyne Valley. We were driving through. I was the passenger at that point, and I was like, "Oh, can we get this? The thing is over there." And Mrs. Soup was like, "Well, we've got to get to the, we were on a very tight schedule. We were meeting up with the in-laws for fish and chips or something on the way home." And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. They're lovely people. They're all lovely. So, but I was very much like, "Oh, I want to see the passage tomb." What I find so interesting is this sense of a legitimate visit, of a legitimate moment. In the moment, I felt as though was being, it was just over there, and I was being dragged away from it. And yet, I was driving through the context of that monument. I was driving through the Boyne Valley. In many ways, I was seeing outside the photograph. I was seeing outside the postcard. And it's only, actually, frankly, in this conversation, but also recently, I started to piece this together. That actually, that was that's a legitimate experience in its own right. But on the day, I mean, I was sort of on social media. I nearly visited the Boyne Valley. I was a little bit disappointed. But and I wonder if would it be sort of. So now I'm almost imagining like an art project that could be attached to your sort of work, where maybe you go to Cairo and you photograph just the tips of the pyramids with buildings in the front. Is that still visiting the pyramid? Is that still seeing them?
Like I said, once went to Italy on a very brief kind of whistle-stop tour. So I was in Rome for like a day or a night or something. So I didn't have time to do properly. So I went on a walking tour of Rome at night. So you kind of walk up to the Forum, you walk up to the Colosseum. You don't go in any of them.
No.
So it's like, but have I really been to the Colosseum then? Like I've stood outside it.
Yeah.
I've not been in it. I've not taken photographs of it. Have I really been there?
I haven't been accosted by a man wearing a tin foil Roman outfit asking for
no, I really experienced Rome then. No one was wearing a fake gladiator outfit or anything.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's like you say, you don't just materialise out of the ether at the passage tombs.
No.
You've got to get through the landscape to get there, and yet that's often removed from the experience. It's just being at this one site and looking at that one angle. It kind of decontextualises the entire site or landscape, and which is part of that experience, part of that site is not just that bit, but how you get there, and what happens.
And maybe we should treasure not quite getting the shot.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Let's treasure our slightly off-angle, wonky ones, or someone's walking in front of your camera.
Yeah.
I'll
have to say thank you to Mr. Soup then tonight. Thank you. We didn't quite get to go to
things differently.
Indeed, my eyes have been opened. Okay, cool. Well, is there anything just final then that you'd like to say? Is there anything that you think people should know or don't? There's some interesting element of folklore and archaeology and all this sort of other stuff that people often might be surprised by, because sometimes there's like a niggling little thing that especially that a specialist or an archaeologist will just go, well, actually, I wish more people didn't do that or knew this or knew that. Anything that comes to mind?
Not particularly. I just think it's worth putting out. I technically am an archaeologist, but I'm dealing with stories and postcards. But and I think a lot of people might not think, oh, you can do that with archaeology, or that's something that's a legitimate way of exploring the past. And this is kind of what we were talking about earlier. There is such a broad way of thinking and doing in archaeology that perhaps that might surprise people a little bit. That I'm not out there with my trowel. In fact, I don't even know where my trowel is anymore.
Oh,
lost my trowel. But also, yes, just say if anybody has got any postcards of Crete at any point, please do drop me a line. I'd be fascinated to see them from any period, really. like I said, I'm focusing on that period at the moment, but I'm really interested in seeing how these develop over time. Do the sites, do the angles, do the perspectives change? Does the focus change? And what can that tell us about the experience of a site and what that the wider context of what people are after or interested in when they go to these sites? So yes, please feel free to drop me a postcard or a scan of a postcard or something.
Okay. So it just occurred to me, there's so much that you could bring to this, isn't there? And so much as obviously there's a technological element. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, an immediate one would be color. How does color change how people view the site? But then, aerial photography. Also, the casual use of someone in a microlight going, "Dook," there's the site and flying away. Yeah, there's lots to think. Yeah,
Exactly. The issue I have with this potential project is it is so broad, because every time I talk about it, someone brings up another idea, I'm like, oh, I haven't really thought about that, or and it incorporates development of technology, but then people talk about the postal system, and I was like, I don't know anything about the history of the postal system, but that would be interesting as well to think about, and how all these kind of things. But yeah, actually, do the pictures and how they change over time, is that reflecting what's important to the viewer, or is that reflecting changes in technology, both in terms of photography but also in print? Nowadays you get a lot of those postcards that are multiple scenes in one. It'll say like Crete, and then it'll have 4 or 5 different images superimposed. I'm not entirely sure when they came on board, when they started being produced, but again, that's a different,
like almost like a collage. Yeah,
kind of collage ones. And then of course everyone's perennial favorite one, this is Knossos at night, and it's just a black postcard.
I hadn't seen that one.
This is, I literally bought this the other day. It's pinned on my wall. This is my new favorite postcard.
Oh, very nice. Yeah.
And I think this is actually, as well as being, funny, I think you can think a lot about archaeological reconstruction and authenticity using this postcard. But also, you've got Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse, so it's kind of fun as well. But so yes, you can do all kinds of things with postcards.
Yeah.
It's
cool.
And it's just a different way of thinking about the past.
Okay, so to a certain extent, the message is, don't give you new ideas.
I already have too many ideas.
Just send postcards.
Yeah, just the postcards. Though I am open to any thoughts, and if anyone has a particular perspective on postcards, I'd be good to hear it. But I might not probably be able to do anything with it for a while.
Cool. Well, thank you once again for your time today. It's been a real pleasure. And if people have any thoughts or comments, please do comment below. And if they're particularly interesting, I'll definitely pass them on. Can't guarantee that Katy will be able to check in on the video. I mean, she's got better things to do with her life. But yes, hopefully the conversation will continue below, and we'll see where that goes. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.